Okay, so now we're on to our third topic, which is that of the New Testament authors' attitudes towards the scriptural texts. So we've discussed two examples where the apparent differences in wording between the New Testament text and the quoted Old Testament text probably involve the New Testament author's adaptation or tweaking of his Old Testament text for his purposes. So if the New Testament author employed the Septuagint, he also modified it to suit his rhetorical aims. But why did NT authors apparently feel free to pick the version that suited them best, or to rework the biblical or authoritative text that they were quoting to suit their purposes? Why would they do that?
Yeah, again, this series of questions has certain assumptions built into them. And let me unpack those just a little bit first. Initially, we have to ask whether the New Testament writers were aware that they had various Greek versions for the entire range of Septuagint documents from which they might choose to quote.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what was their degree of knowledge about these textual traditions? Further, could they access some or all of these versions or recensions or revisions when they desired in order to pick the one that, as you expressed it, suited their point of view in the discourse?
Right.
As well, it assumes that the New Testament writers thought that some versions of the Jewish scriptures were more accurate and therefore contradicted others about certain matters, and so they needed to choose the one that in their view created the greatest coherence with their particular ideology. So did every New Testament writer have the capacity to access and use both Greek and Hebrew texts in their variations for all parts of the Jewish scriptures? And whether any or all of these assumptions are true in every case is difficult, if not impossible, to prove. But I think we have to keep it in mind, these things in mind, as we try to assess sort of these questions. What it seems to me we do know are the following things. First, whatever text they cite using an introductory formula, this text is for them conveying Yahweh's revelation. And while it may differ in wording from some other forms of the Jewish sacred text, whether in Greek or Hebrew, in their perspective, it is still presenting Yahweh's word. Their task was to interpret this word in alignment with the mission, person, and teaching of Jesus Messiah, because that's what they were representing. For the most part, the New Testament writers, secondly, received teaching either from Jesus or his apostles or other early Christian leaders about the relationship between Jesus and the Jewish scriptures. And all indications we have in the New Testament documents themselves suggest that Jesus himself took time to introduce his followers to these texts in the Jewish tradition that demonstrated Yahweh's purposes were being fulfilled in him. And in addition, he indicated then how such texts should be interpreted in order to reveal their true intent, in contrast to traditional interpretations or those argued by other contemporary Jewish sects such as Essenes or Pharisees or Sadducees. Thirdly, I'd suggest that the use of Old Testament texts in the New Testament writings was in part designed to teach new generations of Christians how to interpret these Jewish scriptures appropriately for teaching and other purposes, such as we might find described in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 16. In some way, each of these New Testament documents, more or less, becomes a kind of manual of hermeneutics for understanding the Jewish tradition. Fourthly, in my view, the variety of texts, both Hebrew and Greek, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls indicates that these communities valued them all. And we do not seem to find occasions when they use one text form to argue against another text form. I presume the same perspective then was operative within the early Christian community. They challenged interpretations of these texts, but not necessarily the forms of the texts themselves.
Right. So this leads to another question, and your last comment touches on this. we might say, since the New Testament authors adopt these practices, often adapting the text and or choosing as a starting point a base text that suits their rhetorical aims. So, what can we infer from this, concerning how they viewed their their authoritative texts? Would you say that they considered the Septuagint as something different from the Hebrew text in terms of its message, in terms of its authority, even?
Yes, again, embedded in the question is the assumption that the New Testament writers had the choice of various Old Testament and Old Testament Greek and Hebrew texts, and had the skill necessary to compare them closely. And then in my previous response, of course, I challenge this just a little bit. However, let's suppose that Paul, when writing Romans 1:17, perhaps in Corinth in the middle of the first century CE, had access to the Old Greek text of the 12, as well as the Kaige recension that we have from Nahal Hever of Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, as well as a proto-Masoretic copy of the appropriate Hebrew text. But let's suppose he had access to all three of those. We have a good sense of the Old Greek text of Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, based on Ziegler's edition in the Göttingen text. We have Bartholomew's published partial text of Habakkuk 2, verse 4, as he reconstructs it from the Nahal Hever manuscript, which is, of course, identified as the Kaige recension, done perhaps just shortly before Paul writes Romans or thereabouts. And then we have a proto-Masoretic text, as best we can determine, reflected in our Masoretic text of Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 4. And let's suggest then that Paul had copies of each of these, or at least access to them in some way, as he's writing the book of Romans in Corinth, right? And so as he's doing this, we then find that he is citing Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4 in this particular context. And he's doing it presumably because for him, it is critical to the explanation of the nature of the gospel in order to show that's a true representation excuse me, of what Yahweh was revealing in the Old Testament or the Jewish tradition. Now, if he knew of differences between the Greek and the Hebrew text forms, he does not seem to argue that one is more accurate than another in Romans 1:17 or the context. Rather, he just seems to assume that the text form that he is citing communicates Yahweh's intended meaning in perhaps a more explicit form than that found in the corresponding Hebrew text or an alternative Greek revision. So in the case of Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, the primary difference that we find in Paul's citation is in the absence of any personal pronoun with the noun pistos, faith. So the Greek, the Old Greek translation talks about my faith, and the Hebrew tradition talks about his faith. Paul just talks about faith. Now, is it a case that Paul's Old Greek translation that he had access to, presuming that's what he's citing here, because apart from the absence of the pronoun, it seems to conform to that particular textual tradition? Is the absence then of that pronoun evidence that he had a different Greek text? Or did he find the variations between the Septuagint version, my faith, and the Hebrew text, his faith, something that wasn't going to be helpful in his argument? And he didn't want to have to choose or argue that one was right or wrong, because for him, the critical question was faith. It didn't matter whether it was my faith or his faith, whether it was God's faithfulness or human faith. He's going to ring the changes on that in his argument in Romans 1-3. And so for him, the critical question is faith. And perhaps then he just decides to not include a personal pronoun because for him it's not a critical question at this point in time. So these are kind of the questions that I have as I come to a text like this. And I think the evidence in this case is that he's using the Old Greek translation. Yes, the version that he has in his text is slightly different, but I think for his purposes within the discussion of Romans, the alteration is sensible and does not require us to postulate a different Greek text per se. He certainly isn't accessing, in this case, a Hebrew version that lacks, as far as we know, a personal pronoun, because as far as we know, there isn't one. So those would be some considerations as we think about how New Testament writers were considering the various texts of the Jewish tradition.
Thank you. So yeah, that's a very interesting, a good example also there, because the Old Testament passage has several variants, and as you say, it's always related to what the New Testament author is trying to do or trying to communicate.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of implications for how they view the scripture, the variety of forms of scripture.
Right.
So what are some resources that one may consult to find out more concerning how New Testament authors viewed their scriptures?
Sure. I found the two essays by Earl Ellis, The Old Testament Canon in the Early Church and Biblical Interpretation in the New Testament Church, published in Mikra, Text Translation, Reading and Interpretation of the Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism and Early Christianity, edited by Martin Mulder and Harry Sisling, helpful, as well as the shorter book by Gregory Beale, Handbook on the New Testament Use of the Old Testament, that was recently published.
Okay, thanks. And we'll put those references at the end of the video here for people who might want to look them up. Thanks again, Larry.